Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We've got this meticulously compiled stack of sources, and they all tell one woman's story.
But it's a story with some really universal lessons, I think.
Absolutely. We're going to try and understand the life of Winnie Letha Currey. She lived from 1903 to 1992, so her life basically spanned the entire American century, and it was almost all anchored in one place, Kansas.
And our sources, well, they're not the grand historical narratives you might be used to. We're not looking at presidential papers here.
No, not at all.
We're looking at the tiny fragments of a life, things like census reports, city directories, faded newspaper clippings, even receipts for things like a tombstone.
And that's the whole mission here, isn't it? To see how much of a life, how much resilience and local history can be pieced together from these small, almost bureaucratic details.
Exactly. How do you build a full story out of a tax receipt and an address listing?
So let's set the scene. Winnie's journey begins in Lansing, Kansas, back in 1903, but that beginning, it was very quickly marked by profound instability.
Yeah, that's putting mildly. If you just look at the records from the first 10 years of her life, there's already this pattern of movement. The family moves from Lansing to Rooks County, Kansas.
Right.
We see her in the 1910 census, just a 6-year-old kid living with her father. It was a transient working-class life even before the real trauma hit.
And that trauma arrived in 1913.
That was the defining fracture point of her entire childhood. In September 1913, Winnie's mother, Winifred May Hutchinson, passed away.
Aw.
And Winnie was just over 10 years old.
And you have to put this in context, right? This is pre-New Deal America.
Oh, absolutely. There was no social safety net. I mean, none. The loss of a parent, especially the mother who ran the home, it often meant just immediate economic and social collapse for the family.
And the sources show the result of that collapse, which was, well, terrifying, the scattering of the children.
Exactly. The family just couldn't hold together. The two youngest siblings, Alma and Ernest, they were placed immediately with other families, a very common and wrenching fate for kids in that situation.
But Winnie and her older sisters, Mary and Myrtle, they ended up somewhere even more formal.
Yes. In June 1914, so less than a year after their mother died, the three girls were placed in a children's home in Kansas City, Missouri.
They were institutionalized.
Institutionalized. It's such a profound shift, going from a family, no matter how unstable, to a regulated public setting, all before her 11th birthday.
It's just a stark illustration of how vulnerable people were in that era.
And what's fascinating is how quickly she's forced into independence. I mean, the records show this brief, fleeting moment of stability around June 1916. Winnie and Mary are living with their father again.
And they actually managed to graduate from school.
They did, from Horseman School in Kansas City.
Yeah.
But childhood was, for all intents and purposes, over.
That's what really stands out to me, because the very next year, 1917, she's only 14 years old, and she's a wage earner.
Yep. The records place Winnie and her sisters living with an Aunt Nora in North Kansas City, and they're all working in a factory.
At 14.
That factory job tells you everything you need to know about the economic reality.
Yeah.
When you lose that family foundation, you're thrust into the labor market no matter how old you are. This wasn't a summer job, this was survival.
So if that first phase of her life was defined by loss and scattering, the second phase feels like it's defined by this almost desperate drive to regain control, to find stability.
And we see that anchor get dropped in 1918. This is where the Dodge City chapter begins.
She moves west.
She moves west to Dodge City, Kansas, in February of 1918. And the reason she went, according to the records, was to help her sister, Myrtle, who was having her first child.
And that one small detail, a teenager traveling to help her sister, it sets the course for the next 74 years of her life.
It does. It's a real pivot point. And what's interesting is that stability for her wasn't found through a career at that point. It was found through family duty.
She grows up incredibly fast in this new environment. By December 24th, 1919, she marries Leon Russell Crawford in Dodge City. She's only 16.
Just 16. And that fact is so loaded with cultural weight. The wedding announcement in the local paper, the Dodge City Daily Globe, it makes a point to mention that Leon was a World War veteran, recently discharged from honorable service.
So this wasn't just two kids getting married.
No. This was a post-WWI union. It symbolized a return to domesticity, to structure, after a global war. For a young woman whose life had been nothing but chaos, marrying a veteran, someone associated with service and order, well, that gave her a social legitimacy she desperately needed.
And they start building that life immediately. The 1920 census puts them at their first residence on Avenue A. But stability is always fragile, isn't it?
It is. And what happens next is just profoundly sad.
Their first child.
Yes. The sources document their first attempt to start a family, and it ends in tragedy.
Yeah.
In May of 1921, their first child, a daughter named Betty Jean Crawford, was born, and she died just about an hour later.
And the newspaper death notice gives us that specific, painful detail. An hour.
It's the brutal irony of this kind of deep dive, We have the precise, cold, archival record of a life that barely even began. For Winnie, who had already been through so much loss, this must have felt like a devastating repetition of that grief.
And yet, at the same time, you can see the family trying to knit itself back together.
You can. The 1925 census shows Winnie settled firmly in Dodge City on Avenue G. And crucially, the records also show that her father and her younger siblings, Ernest and Alma, the ones who were scattered a decade earlier, they're all living in nearby Gray County.
Wow. So they're clustering.
They're clustering in western Kansas.
Yeah.
That initial fracture had begun to mend itself, at least geographically. Once Winnie established an anchor, the others slowly gravitated back towards her.
That pull of kinship.
Exactly. And that new, more stable environment allowed them to grow their own family. They have two sons, Eugene David Crawford in 1927, and then Leon Russell Crawford II, or LR, in 1938.
But before we move into those decades of stability, there's one small detail, a transaction really that I think is incredibly telling. It connects the two halves of her life.
I know what you're talking about, the gravestone.
The gravestone. A record from May 1946 shows that Winnie purchased a gravestone for her mother, Winifred, who had been buried back in Olathe, Kansas, 33 years earlier.
To me, this is one of the most psychologically insightful details we have. 33 years after the death that blew her world apart, Winnie, now a settled, middle-aged woman, takes on the responsibility of memorializing the mother whose loss defined her childhood.
It's like she's closing a loop.
She is literally closing the loop on a chapter of her life that began with absolute chaos. It's a posthumous act of duty that tells you so much about her character.
So now we enter this period of real definitive stability, the 1940s and 50s. If the first part of her life was about fighting for a foundation, this part is about building a fortress on top of it.
Totally. The city directories and census records, they stop being records of movement. They become confirmations of permanence. We see Winnie living at two main addresses in Dodge City, first on Avenue G, and later at 911 2nd Avenue, from the 1950s onward.
Which, during the end of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, just staying in one place was a victory.
It was a huge victory, and that stability allowed her to build a professional life, too. The sources show she was employed at Eccles Department Store in Dodge City.
For quite a while.
For over 5 years, from March 53 to August 58. And, that 5-year stretch is not just a line on a resume, it's a window into the post-war economy. Eccles was probably a central fixture in town, and having that professional identity, it added to the social currency she was building.
But the real story of her stability is in her community involvement. It's massive.
It really is. The sources list all these affiliations. She was a member of the First United Methodist Church, heavily involved in the VFW and American Legion Auxiliaries, the Social Order of Beauchamp.
And we really need to unpack what these groups meant in mid-century Kansas.
You do.
Yeah.
Because these weren't just social clubs. They were the backbone of the community. They were the social safety net, providing mutual aid, support, a collective identity for people.
So for someone whose own identity was shattered by being put in a children's home, what would joining these highly structured, almost ritualistic organizations like the Order of Eastern Star, what would that have meant to her?
I think it was a very conscious choice. She was embedding herself in institutions that promised permanence and belonging. The very things that were violently stripped from her as a child. Feels a bit like an overcompensation for that early trauma. She sought out the ritual, the structure.
And the dedication is just staggering. We have a specific record. Around 1970, she gets a 50-year pin from the Order of Eastern Star.
50 years.
50 years of service.
Think about that. That's not just membership. That is ownership of your community. It suggests that once she found her anchor, her home, her family, her organizations, she held on with this fierce, unwavering dedication. Winnie Currey wasn't just living in Dodge City. She was an institution herself.
Yeah, her routine seems so fixed during this time. The only brief break we can find is a little news clipping from August 1959. It says she took a vacation to Taos, New Mexico, and Arizona.
A well-deserved break, I'd say. But it just underscores how laser-focused she was on Dodge City. She had built this stable, predictable life, and she was guarding it.
But that hard-won stability only made the next tragedy hit that much harder. Our sources give us an almost heartbreaking amount of detail about her younger son, Leon Russell Crawford II, LR.
He was a shining star, The archives capture it all. We have his high school achievements, perfect spelling awards, a debate letter, National Thespian Society. He was a brilliant student.
Earned a scholarship, was pursuing a doctorate.
A doctorate in radiology in Madison, Wisconsin. His future was just, it
Yeah.
was one of massive promise.
And all that detail, that whole trajectory, makes the final record about him so crushing. Leon Russell Crawford II died unexpectedly on February 10th, 1961.
He was only 22, attending graduate school. It's the second time in her life she has to face a catastrophic, sudden loss. First her mother, then her infant daughter, and now her promising son.
And the sources show that ripple effect of pain.
They do. Just weeks after LR's death, in March '61, there's a condolence letter from her Aunt Dora in California. That small piece of paper shows the family network rallying around her, just like they'd clustered around her in western Kansas decades before.
And even through that pain, she keeps investing in family. A few years later, August 1964, we see she attended a Currey family reunion in Sedona, Arizona. She never let those ties get completely severed.
No matter how many times tragedy struck.
As she gets older, the focus of the documents shifts. It's less about achievements and more about, well, practical arrangements.
The end-of-life logistics. The record shows she granted power of attorney to her remaining son, Eugene, in 1976.
And we see that commitment to memorialization come back again. She purchased a tombstone in January 1978.
Just like she did for her mother. She was ensuring her own affairs, her own legacy, were meticulously organized. It's a final act of imposing structure on the ultimate chaos of mortality.
After nearly 9 decades defined by Kansas, Winnie Letha Currey died on February 11, 1992. She was 88 years old, buried in Maple Grove Cemetery, concluding a life that, started in fragments and ended as this cohesive, permanent part of her community's history.
I think what we've distilled here is this powerful blueprint for survival. Her life, documented by these bare bureaucratic necessities, ration books, deed transfers, membership records. It tells the story of a woman who was scattered by tragedy but used every ounce of her will to become an immovable pillar of her society.
That's the astonishing power of archival detail, isn't it? She didn't write a memoir, but she left this meticulous paper trail that let us reconstruct her life's quest for stability. She made sure her mother was remembered. She documented the life of her lost son. Her legacy is preserved in hundreds of these seemingly mundane facts.
And it really raises a powerful question for you, the listener, about documentation and legacy. Winnie's story is contained in these physical fragments of paper, the factory work record, the marriage announcement, that 50-year service pin. We live in a world where so much of our documentation is digital and ephemeral. So considering the sheer specificity of the facts that told her story, what fragments are we unintentionally leaving behind today that will truly tell the story of our own personal century?